Our second scripture reading this morning comes from the Gospel according to Luke, the 15th chapter. Jesus said, a certain man had 2 sons. The younger son said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the inheritance." Then the father divided his estate between them. Soon afterward, the younger son gathered everything together and took a trip to a land far away. And there he wasted his wealth through extravagant living. When he had used up his resources, a severe food shortage arose in that country, and he began to be in need. He hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. He longed to eat his fill from what the pigs ate, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have more than enough food, but I'm starving to death? I will get up and go to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Take me on as one of your hired hands.' And so he got up and went to his father. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was moved with compassion. His father ran to him, hugged him, and kissed him. And then his son said, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quickly, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Fetch the fattened calf and slaughter it. We must celebrate with feasting, because this son of mine was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his older brother, or his older son, was in the field. And coming in from the field, he approached the house and heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and he asked what was going on. And the servant replied, 'Your brother has arrived, and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf because he received his son back safe and sound.' And then the older son was furious and didn't want to enter in, but his father came out and begged him. And he answered his father, 'Look, I've served you all these years, and I have never disobeyed your instruction. Yet you've never given me as much as a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours returned, after gobbling up your estate on prostitutes, you slaughtered the fattened calf for him.' Then the father said, 'Son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found.'" The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, last Sunday we began talking about a force which controls our world and affects all of our lives in one way or another. It is the power of money and possessions. And we called this power financial gravity. And here's a real quick definition of financial gravity, just to remind you. It is that invisible force which compels us to pursue our basic necessities. All of us are moved by this need, this desire to provide necessities such as food and shelter and clothing and medical care and education, etc. However, sometimes we can begin to react to this pull of financial gravity, this pull of providing for the things that we need in ways that are not helpful. And in fact, we can begin to do things which are actually destructive. And instead of using our financial resources to help ourselves and those we love, We begin to waste our resources on things that we don't need. And instead of being a generous people, we become people who are frightened of scarcity. Well, today we're going to consider another rich man who appears in the Gospels. And today we are going to talk about a character in the parable that Jesus told about a loving father. He is the younger of two sons who feels financial gravity with such force that he goes to his father and he asks for his inheritance early. I mean, could you imagine your child coming up to you and saying, "Hey, Dad, I know you're not dead yet, but I know I'm in your will. Why don't you just go ahead and give me half of everything you have, and I can go ahead and spend that now, and I don't have to wait for you to die." You'd be a little disappointed in your child, wouldn't you? Not only a little disappointed, but you'd probably be a little bit offended too, wouldn't you? If it was me, I sure wouldn't accept any Halloween candy from him, right? Quick funny story about this. A true story. Guy came home from work. This would have been about a year ago. And there was a piece of paper laying on the desk in our family room. And I go, "Oh, what's that?" And Anita goes, "That's some life insurance I signed you up for." I go, "What?" She goes, "Yeah, it came in the mail from the conference, and it wasn't too bad. So I just went ahead and signed you up for it." Okay. Next thing out of her mouth, "Are you ready for dinner?" I wasn't hungry. Right? That's how we would feel, wouldn't it? And I'm sure that's how this father felt. But he loved his son. And so he gave him half of all he had. Jesus' parables often place people in odd scenarios to make their point clear. And the point of this story, I think, is very clear. This young man wanted to pursue fully the kingdom of self. See, there was this big world out there, and he wanted to go and be a part of it. And whatever he wanted, he was going to get. Possessions, drink, women, it didn't matter. He wanted to have a good time, and he wanted to live in the here and the now, and it didn't matter to him that his behavior would hurt his family and ultimately himself. This young man must have felt powerful and excited as he set his course and he began to experience the pull of a distant land. And having spent his life in a fairly confined space, he was excited to begin a great adventure. But what he didn't know was that he was about to be sucked into a black hole. Now, a black hole is a place in space where the gravity is so great that nothing can escape its pull, not even light, which is why they're called black holes. And a black hole can't be seen. It can only be felt. You can only tell that a black hole is there by the effects that it's having on the things around it. Once something enters the gravitational field of a black hole, the effect is dramatic. You can't escape. You're going to get sucked in. The kingdom of self is a space full of black holes. When we live for the kingdom of self, when we live for the kingdom of us, we are always going to run into these black holes that suck us in, that we find hard to escape. For many people, money and the things it buys can produce a level of gravity from which they simply cannot escape. One of the worst combinations in this regard, I think, is to place a large sum of money in the hands of a person with low spiritual or emotional maturity. And this is exactly what happened to this young man in this parable. And his spending choices were, I think, kind of predictable. The Bible says, soon afterward, the younger son gathered everything together and took a trip to a faraway land. There he wasted his wealth through extravagant living. Most of us understand the problem faced by this young man. He was anxious to be independent, but he was immature, and immature people have trouble handling money. Any of you who have ever had children in college know what I'm talking about. His vision was limited to a brief few hours into the future. His impulse control was so weak that all options for how to spend Daddy's money looked equally inviting. And he lived fast and large until it was all gone. And then he stumbled away in regret when a famine picked the last coin from his pocket. The once rich but then very poor young man in Jesus' parable eventually returned home. And he knew that he deserved his father's anger. But he was hungry and he was desperate. And so he decided to ask his dad for a job on the estate. And as he walked up that familiar road home, he was amazed when he saw the old man running toward him. But he was also a bit worried. Because see, it was beneath the dignity of an older man in Israel to run anywhere, much less toward a son who had brought shame to the family. And the son must have taken this as a sign of bad things to come. I'm sure he was thinking to himself, wow, if he's running toward me, he must really be angry. That was the day the son learned about the father's generous spirit. The father restored him to the household and put a ring on his finger. He was brought a new robe to wear. It was a kindness he did not deserve, forgiveness he did not merit, and love that he did not anticipate. His father's generosity gave him a new life. Think of how that experience must have changed the son's character. The selfish boy died. A new man was resurrected in his place through his father's love. We can imagine that rather than thinking only about himself, he now looked to the needs of others. Extravagant living in some distant land would no longer appeal to him. Being with his father, enjoying the company of his father, doing the will of his father would be what now brought him joy. And he would be kinder and more gracious as a person. Most important of all, rather than simply being a recipient of his father's generosity, he now possessed the insight to become a participant in it. I'm reminded of Luke 12:48, which says, "Much is required from those to whom much is given, for their responsibility is greater." I think that this young man began to understand that just as his father had been generous to him, he now needed to be generous to others. I think a similar revelation happens to those of us who follow Christ. At first, everything is about us. What can the Lord do for me? What is in this for me? But once we begin to recognize and experience God's generous acceptance of us, our lives are changed. And we begin to recognize the difference between being a beneficiary of God's kingdom and being a participant in God's kingdom. This orientation toward God's kingdom is life-altering. It creates an identity founded in generosity. Generous people see themselves, see their lives, see their purpose differently than people whose lives are weighed down by financial gravity. Generous people are more interested in what they can give than in what they can get. In a word, we become stewards. A steward is a person who manages another's property. Stewards have broad discretionary powers on how an account is managed and how a household is run. But they know that primarily they are servants looking not to their self-interest but to the welfare of the owner. Christ followers understand that they are stewards of a gift given to them by God. A life with unique strengths gifts and talents and abilities and resources to use in ways guided by God's own Spirit that lives within them, so as to honor and glorify the giver of the Spirit, the giver of the gift. Sadly, most Christians do not truly act as God's steward, and there's a reason for it. Financial gravity pulls us toward a deep belief that we are the sole owners of what we possess, and that we can use it to support the lifestyle we desire. Being an owner means we can make decisions free of the control and even the consideration of others. We submit to no one when financial gravity holds us back. Most people in the United States live like owners. And if I'm an owner, all that I have is mine. I can do as I wish. In their great little book, The Paradox of Generosity, Christian Smith and Hillary Davidson review some data, and they find that very large numbers of Americans, despite wanting to enjoy happy, healthy, purposeful lives, fail to practice the kinds of generosity that actually tend to lead to happiness, health, and purpose in life. Something gets in their way. And this data that they share in their book, it captured a 5-year multidisciplinary Science of Generosity initiative. In this survey of 2,000 Americans, along with some in-depth interviews, really offers some new insights into the positive outcomes of generosity when it's exhibited or withheld in the life of an individual or a family. And here is what they found. They found that 44.8% of Americans reported that they gave 0 of their income to any charitable purpose. 44.8% gave nothing to any charity in the previous year. I mean, that's 0. That's not $1. They didn't even put a quarter in one of those plastic funnels at the grocery store that goes down into whatever that goes into. Think about it. Nearly half of us gave away zip, nada, squat, zilch, nothing. These people, they turned down the Girl Scouts. They refused high school band collections. They didn't buy a mumpkin. They did not slow the offering plate at church. They ignored cancer research. They told the Salvation Army they had no change for Christmas, and then said, I didn't give at the office either. The report went on to say this: another 41.3% of Americans gave less than 2% of their income away. This means that the vast majority of financial generosity in the U.S. is offered by about 15% of the population that is willing to give away more than 2% of their income. Now, you may be thinking, but at least people gave their time and their talent, and that's valuable, right? Yeah, it is very valuable. Volunteerism is extremely important to charitable organizations. But in that same study, they found that 76% of the people self-reported that they gave no volunteer hours to any organization either. They didn't give any time to church, or to the local high school band boosters, or to a food pantry, nothing. That is 3 out of 4 people, which is kind of a remarkable number. Lack of generosity is not about resources. It is about identity. Stewards understand that they are custodial agents of whatever sum they administer. They manage money and assets with the thought of pleasing the true owner. In order to become a steward of financial resources, one has to accept the challenge to set aside an amount of money to invest in the work of God's kingdom. Many Christians, as a way to get serious about their desire to participate in God's work, pursue generosity through proportional giving of their income with a tithe as the goal. And a tithe, in case you didn't know, is 1/10 of your income. For those Christians, a tithe is the first and the best of what they have, not the last and what is left over. Now, the tithe was a practice God gave to the people of Israel. The money from the tithe was used to support the worship life of the nation and to take care of the most vulnerable people in society. So why would God ask them to do this? It's not as if the Almighty is short of money or has lost the power to create it. Clearly, God is not in need of the tithe. It is possible that the tithe is requested not for God's sake, but for ours. It seems clear that the tithe is intended to be a discipline that enables people to help expand God's kingdom. As they give their tithe, they become God's servants. And through their generosity, they gain a sense of identity. The practice of proportional giving calls them to offer their best for God's kingdom as a way to live into their identity as stewards. How does the practice of generosity change us? Well, let's watch this video and find out.
I have always tithed, and I am so glad that I did. It is one of the decisions that brought greater meaning to my life. My husband died when we were young. My son and daughter were children. Then one day I was at a meeting of the Ladies' Auxiliary at the church, and they announced what would be done with the thank offering that was taken every November. I came home sad because I knew we couldn't do that. There just wasn't a penny left over. My son saw that I was sad and asked me what was bothering me. I told him that I wanted to be a part of the thank offering in November, but even with all the time between now and November, I wouldn't be able to help. He said that if I wanted to give to that offering, we would do it together. We put a mason jar on the kitchen table. He and his sister took odd jobs, doing farm work or pulling weeds in gardens. They didn't make much, but they would bring their pennies and nickels home and put them in the jar. The country was still recovering from the Depression. It was hard for a woman to find a job. I had to work and take care of the children. I took in sewing and would put any money we didn't need in the jar. We kept a garden and we watched our money, but I always wanted my children to see that giving was a part of life. I just took that portion out first and we lived on the rest. And it was hard, but we did it. Bit by bit, pennies turned to nickels, nickels turned to dimes, and then quarters. By the time November came around, we had a few dollars. I had the children come with me to the meeting, and together we put our offering on the table with everyone else's. I think it was one of the proudest and happiest things we ever did together.
The woman in that video, Ms. Margaret, shaped the life of her family through generosity. Whether your tithes fit in a mason jar or a large trust fund, you could do the same. The only way to gain her joy is to take on her practice. As Christians, we are called to be stewards of all that we have, from our possessions and money to our time and our abilities. God calls us to be faithfully employed in God's service. Yet all too often, financial gravity restricts and inhibits true stewardship. We are holding tight rather than letting go. Many people who love God and want to honor Christ and seek the will of the Holy Spirit in their lives have not made the move from being a recipient of God's grace to being a generous participant in God's kingdom. The problem is not that the people lack desire. Most people who don't give simply can't give. Learning how to align your life for generosity is what we will talk about next. Aligning our lives to our desires. That's what it means to be a good steward for Christ. In your worship bulletin, next week there will be a budget planning sheet. And what we will do is we will work together through that to help us set our budget. So over this next week, I would invite you to look at your current budget, think about that, and have that kind of locked up here when you come to worship next week. Also, as we talked about this morning, it's not just about being a good steward of our financial resources, but also of the times and talents that God has given us. When you exit worship today, over on your left-hand side, if you go out these back doors right here, you'll see a little card table, and spread all over that are a bunch of sheets. And I invite you to look through those sheets. Those are sign-up sheets for a number of different opportunities to serve the Lord here in our church. It's for different ministries, either here at our church or ministries that we are associated with. And we will have even more opportunities next week. So I would invite you to look through those opportunities, prayerfully consider your gifts and talents and what God is calling you to do, and then to sign up for a new ministry next year, a new way of serving the Lord. We have all been given much. Let us be good stewards of the gifts that we have. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, help us to be good stewards. Humble us, Lord, to know that all we have comes from you. Our gifts, our talents, everything comes from you. Help us to use those to your glory, to be a generous people who live by Christ's example of generosity. And it is in his name that we humbly pray. Amen. I invite you to stand and let's join together in our closing hymn, Here I Am, Lord.